society may just collapse on into itself.
How are you positioning yourself across your portfolio?
I think Bittensor is the success of decentralized systems and how they can coordinate.
You certainly do not want DeepMind to be the whole arbiter of what drugs your parents take.
This is basically a tsunami coming for them.
If it's not a 150K, you're not valuable. Welcome back to another episode of Supercycle. I have a repeat guest, Mr. Wei. Wei, welcome to the show, baby. What's going on?
Great to be back, man. The bears are coming out of hibernation, it seems.
No, they've been here for the last 6 months, brother. These guys.
Yeah, it's been a while, hasn't it?
It's a bottom soon, baby. It's okay.
Always, man. You gotta have the mentality of up only. That's what we're here for.
If you say up only, you'll eventually be right.
Eventually be right. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, you gotta be the one that calls it early, right? You can repeatedly call the bottom. If you keep saying it, eventually.
And then delete the rest of the tweets.
Yeah, exactly. Who's gonna call you out?
Coming into this week, I think a lot of what I wanted to talk to you about. You're one of my smartest friends. Also, last time you came on, we spoke a lot about Bittensor and NMR. I think Nume AI has done very well as well. They recently did their annual conference in San Francisco. A lot of the things that our peers are thinking about is it seems like macro says risk off. Macro seems pretty uncertain. Obviously, all of the problems in the Middle East. What's your sense on where we're at in the world, and how are you positioning yourself in terms of across your portfolio?
I think macro is the biggest factor this year. Just to set the context, right? Like 2025 was basically markets on easy mode coming out of Liberation Day. I think we were in a regime where you can literally buy anything and make money since April of 2025. And it was, I think from my perspective, was a fat pitch moment when literally Trump came out with the poster board and said these are the tariff levels that we're levying on all these different countries. That was basically the buy signal because, at that point, the tariff news was fully priced in. Could not have gotten any worse than that from a sentiment perspective. It was a very severe and swift drawdown. And it was a great setup for risk assets, especially for anything that was leveraged to the AI theme. And I think what you saw in 2025 was a pricing in on the magnitude of this infrastructure build out that's necessary to take AI to the next level. But I think that narrative is now pretty much fully priced in. It's run its course. And I think the setup right now is very uncertain going into the midterm elections in the US. And given, the anticipation that Trump is likely going to be more hampered coming out of midterms in terms of how he's able to institute and continue to implement policies with a more fragmented kind of government. I think that's going to be built in as a risk premium into the market. And I think the markets are starting to price that in. Obviously, we're in the midst of this kind of oil/war in the Middle East type of environment right now. And obviously with oil kind of shooting up, I don't know where it is now, but the crazy volatility that we've seen in the last week, that's directly counter to where Trump wants to be and where the market feels more at ease, which is lower inflation, softer oil, such that the Fed has the ability to continue to ease into what's going to be a more uncertain kind of midterm election cycle. That's where markets want to be, but we're not getting that. So I think this is causing consternation. Obviously, VIX is kind of rising. The trend is rising off of the back of that. And I think it's setting up for a more uncertain environment. And if you look at crypto, then Bitcoin and ETH probably front run some of that. Ironically, Bitcoin and ETH is somewhat resilient in the last couple of days in this trading week relative to equities. So I think we're getting a little bit of that kind of rebalancing effect. Some of the hardest hit areas are probably oversold a little bit. So it's showing relative strength in kind of this local trading region. But yeah, I think macro is going to be the biggest story this year. It's going to be a much more difficult money-making environment in 26 relative to 25 after April. That's That's kind of my base case. And I think we're in for some downside, I would say downside pressure probably between now and I would say like the start of Q4 of this year. It's going to be a very uncertain picture. That's my base case.
Yeah, crypto is usually the most risk-on part of one's portfolio. And so any uncertainty one has on the world, broader macro, it's probably the first thing that you sell. And so partially the last few days of relative outperformance is probably because everyone's already exited their uncertain bags. Well, at least over the last 6 months has been able to slowly especially going into November, December, tax loss harvest and try to book in some of that positioning. What's really interesting that in some of my conversation with funds, it seems like altcoins are untouchable. Do you think that's true today? Is that a common thought that people have? Are they still holding Bitcoin and ETH? What's your perspective on that?
I would say in general, I think one of the issues that crypto natives have is we're in it for so long that we don't know what the perspective of the outside world is on our community. From an outsider's perspective, especially at this juncture of the market cycle, is like, why would I want to take more risk and go down the risk curve of going to the nth, I don't know, the 50th market cap altcoin relative to just parking my capital within Bitcoin and ETH. If I have a long-term, positive and constructive view of crypto at the current juncture, I would say the outsider's perspective is like, crypto is a show me story. Like, prove to me that all of these altcoins need to exist. And if I'm being as objective as I can be, despite the fact that I spent, a large part of my career in this ecosystem, I think that's warranted because most of the projects in crypto haven't demonstrated product market fit, right? And I think a precursor of this was, and to a great extent it still is like the revenue meta. It's like, where's the revenue? Show me that this protocol, this project, this app actually it can have a sound kind of fundamental basis in terms of how it actually makes money. And I think we kind of overextended to that to a certain degree because, then you had the behavior where revenue is the end all and be all. And then, projects in the very early development part of their life cycle started to use whatever revenue that they were able to generate to buy back tokens. And it's like, well, that's misallocation of capital. But it's just kind of like this propensity to have this, exaggerated swing of the pendulum chasing whatever narrative at that moment is kind of driving sentiment and flows within crypto. But I think generally it's a way of expressing this, I guess, view that the market has, which is like, prove to me that these are viable businesses, prove to me that these are sustainable concepts, that the large part of crypto is still I think in that journey of like discovering and trying to figure out where the product market fit is. So in a prevailing environment where the majors are struggling, there really is no sense for the broader capital markets to bid anything beyond Bitcoin, ETH, and maybe like a Solana and a Hype.
Yeah, I think that I'm hearing more people going bottom hunting, like they're trying to figure out where value is in the market. Are there potentially structurally sound long-term assets in crypto? I mean, I think it's also, people have short memories. 2025 was one of the most important for crypto in institutional adoption versus even 2024. You didn't have people like Stripe building blockchains. You didn't have all these investment banks starting to sell structured products across these assets, digital asset treasuries. And ultimately, you could argue, are some of these things short-term grifts to just monetize public attention? Certainly, a lot of them are. Stripping that all back, there are foundational points here. Digital asset treasuries needed to exist to bridge some of the capital which couldn't interact with crypto directly on Binance, but could purchase something on the NASDAQ. And in particular, pension funds in the US, I think those are real problems that people are trying to solve. Doesn't sound like retail's here at all. It sounds like retail's bidding has been making a bunch of money in the last few months in AI. And so you don't even need to seek returns elsewhere. Just buy AI. It sounds like the prevailing strategy. And it's worked.
Yeah, and I think it's a structurally different market in 2025 and 26 relative to the last cycle, right? In 2020, 2021. at that point, obviously macro was different too. We were coming out of COVID, fiscal, monetary, everything was lined up to speculate on the raciest part of the market. And at that point, crypto had kind of carved out that market positioning as the speculative pool where, capital chased for these outsized returns. Nowadays, there's ample other things that people can punt on besides crypto and altcoins, right? And they're arguably equally, if not more, attractive for that speculator class because of the risk-adjusted returns, right? Like if you look at kind of the AI bottleneck hunting theme that's happening on the equities side of things, you look at memory-based stocks, you have look at like networking, optics, like these subcategories that are high beta proxy plays on the broader AI build-out. These things have ripped 200, 300, from their local bottoms, probably like 10x, 20x is you're able to find on public markets in equities. I saw a stat late last year, like the relative volumes in some of the Korean exchanges for crypto relative to 2024 was like 1/10, right? And then what you've seen in the Korean equity markets this year is an explosion of volume. So like the speculative demand has really shifted. And I think that's just a reflection of different avenues of access for people who are speculating. They don't necessarily have to come to crypto anymore. Not to mention, you also have prediction markets, right? As another avenue where the liquidity and volume and that infrastructure has very much deepened since the last cycle. So there's a lot of alternatives at play. And then to your point, the fundamental institutionalization of crypto and blockchain as infrastructure is not necessarily a reflection of the flows and the speculative energy behind crypto, right? Like those are separate and distinct cycles. So you can make the argument that fundamentally there has never been a better time in terms of adoption of decentralized technology. And that's, factually true, right? If you look at TradFi and Wall Street, like Wall Street is here. Wall Street is starting to adopt blockchain technology. But it remains to be seen, like, does that mean anything for alts? JP Morgan adopting blockchain technology doesn't mean that your bags are going to pump in terms of your meme point portfolio, right? Like JP Morgan is going to co-opt the blockchain technology, like the distributed ledger technology, for its own ends. And that may not have a broad kind of, like trickle down effect into the altcoin space. Now, where it does immediately have a potential impact is, stablecoin adoption, right? And expansion of different types of stablecoins. DeFi theoretically should be a net beneficiary of that as more capital migrate into kind of on-chain primitives over time. And then you see categories like real world assets should benefit because more and more traditional assets, whether it's like credit instruments, whether it's, real estate in different formats, may migrate on chain. And, maybe that could kick off a RWA wave. And all of that should directionally benefit crypto, especially large ecosystems like ETH and Solana, maybe like an Avalanche or more enterprise kind of enterprise like skewed types chains. So I think it is more of a fundamental adoption of the technology. It remains to be seen how this benefits alts. But certainly I think we are somewhere in that trough part of the cycle where sentiment is so bad, where, everything is, capital and liquidity is chasing all the other shiny objects, and crypto, relatively speaking, isn't the sexiest thing. But that's a positive signal if you are a long-term minded investor or a builder, because this is a part of the cycle where you really have to, double down, continue to build, and keep your eyes peeled for opportunities, because this is where you really want to do your homework, right? And pick up assets on the cheap.
I view investing as a social science. Ultimately, you're trying to figure out which technologies are changing how society functions. How do we interact ourselves with the world? And then where does that economic value accrue? I think in front of us, crypto AI are actually divergent technologies in many ways. I think they solve different things. AI on this intelligence exponential amplifier, allowing us to map the world and map science in just exponentially accelerated ways, allows us to push the discoverable universe on what humans can do. Crypto, on the other hand, is innovation on top of trade and economics. And so it's an innovation that was created by humans. Like for us, it's how we represent value, how society rewards work. And so as you think about, they're actually decoupled in my view. AI, let's use the topic of life sciences. Certainly AI is going to help us discover new drugs, accelerate what might have taken labs many, many years to work through, but also potentially help find drugs that can solve diseases that we have not found solutions for. There are so many different areas unmapped in this world. But that can be true, but also for us on a crypto level, when you think about reorganizing how the financial system works, that is a social problem. It's a coordination problem. It's how do we get people cooperating and doing things together? And so certainly AI empowers humans on an intellectual level, but beyond the individual human, there actually is, well, how do we all organize ourselves, and how do we finance the things most important for society to work on? And so crypto, AI, I think people are also realizing hardware/DTech. It's, again, energy, life sciences. These are the last remaining megatrends that is indisputable that will be increasingly more critical for society. Obviously, they all play off each other as well in this self-reinforcing loop. But there are certain industries that just won't matter anymore. There's certain jobs that don't matter anymore. And ultimately, if you talk about wealth creation, you want to be positioned for what are megatrends? What are the things that, as you said, you want to be, that are going to be increasingly more true over the next few years than decreasingly true? And if you position yourself for that, you participate economically, it's hard not to. Positioning like that is actually positioning along humanity, which is humanity owns its problems, that it can actually go out and create new things that progress our own productivity, our own health outcomes, our own longevity. And so those are actually those are intellectual, like these are social problems that we're attempting to tackle, which, when you think about it like that, I disrespect people who leave crypto now even more. The guys who have less attention, who are now like, actually, do you know what? My buddies are into enterprise SaaS AI. I can also do that now.
Bro, that's so bearish. Enterprise SaaS AI is such a bearish.
It's like the worst thing to do. But don't worry, Wei Xie wants you to do it. Don't worry. We're going to automate checklists in the US government. Yeah. Well, that is a big problem, to be honest, right? So,
but honestly, I don't blame Wei Xie. The irony there, though, is like that enterprise, like when you say enterprise SaaS, that industry or sector or whatever you want to call it is likely going to go through this like extremely high velocity creative destruction cycle that crypto has seen and lived over the last 5 years. We've all lived that. Like, the saying is in crypto is like, things move so fast and narratives peak and explode, and then they just wither away equally as fast as they come. And I think what we have kind of grown to become accustomed to as crypto natives is coming for everything in the world because of AI, and they had not yet acclimated to the velocity of this kind of creative destruction cycle. And it's really interesting to see that starting to kind of happen, right? And the January and February the meme has been Claude kind of dropping an update, and the Grim Reaper on the public markets goes and just fucking slash public market multiples, and all of these different categories draw down 15 to 20% intraday because Claude released a new update. in their capabilities. But I think, to your point, technology is creating incredible opportunities to solve problems that we have confronted as humanity for a very long time. The financial implications are incredibly unclear in terms of who's going to win, who's going to lose. How does this wealth redistribution mechanism actually kind of like evolve in this world of rapid creative disruption as a function of AI? So incredibly bullish anything that's on the right side of like technological change in terms of solving the problems. Incredibly uncertain on the other side of the ledger, which is like financially, how do you position for this? But it's an awesome environment for skilled alpha pickers, right? Be able to assess and be very nimble in your framework to adapt to this rapidly changing environment. And I do think like crypto natives, for better for worse, have had to train that muscle way more than everyone else. And we may very well be in a much better starting point than the rest of the world in terms of our ability to adapt, because we just had to do it. Where everyone else is just, this is basically a tsunami coming for them, and it's going to take them a while to kind of adjust to this reality.
The generative generation of text, video, etc., it just means that a lot of the technological advantages of having unique expertise in software kind of goes down. And so it also means that it's actually quite empowering for people who don't have a software background to actually learn and participate. But it also begs the question on how important some of these, our kids, they're going to need to grow up with much more soft skills, human skills, have a good eye for opportunity. The jobs of the future are going to be entrepreneurial. It'll be people who start new projects, manage many projects, many different products at the same time. You're seeing kids on TikTok building OpenClaw like agencies and building. This is, I mean, it's in the last 20 years has been very common. RuneScape gold flippers, Minecraft map creators, like it's what the young kids are up to actually is very informative. They're often the very early adopters of unique technology. Like, wow, they have a very pure view on it. This is awesome. I can't even compare it to what it was like before because that isn't even in my data set. So we find that very interesting. I spent in 2023 and 2024 just talk about the social change that is occurring. I spent a lot of time in Korea. And the whole context on why volume was so high over the previous few years, probably X 25, 26, since equities has made such a big comeback. The volume is driven again socially. This young generation who's just coming into the workforce now over the last few years, their parents grew up in a very prosperous era for Korea. Their parents saw a 30-40 year overnight transformation of Korea into one of the industrial powerhouses. The chaebols, the conglomerates, progressed the country incredibly quickly. They were able to build apartments, buy homes. This next generation was then sold a dream to go to Seoul National University, go get a job at Samsung. But the problems with inflation and having not a very competitive dynamic on a corporate level in Korea, there are no entrepreneurs over there. Well, very little in terms of tech. The dream there is to go work for Sony as the pinnacle of one's existence. It's the same in Japan of just become a salaryman. But unfortunately, that's not good enough. You are not better off than your parents, the generation before. Well, it was very hard to beat them in the first place, but being a salaryman at Sony when these chaebols are family-run businesses looking only after for themselves results in a young person trying to think about, well, how do I look after my family? How do I look after myself? It is certainly not getting a job. I've already reached the pinnacle of social existence in Korea. I work at one of the Sony divisions. And so what assets do I access? It's certainly not Seoul real estate. That doesn't get you can't access that. The incremental kilometer outside of downtown Seoul becomes exponentially lower in price because there's no demand. Everyone wants to be in the major cities. So it's not real estate. Gambling is also illegal in that country. Sports betting is therefore illegal. And so crypto over those few years, especially with how early they were adopters in the major creation of the exchanges, Bithumb, Upbit, Coin One over 2018 to 2021. There's been major fluctuations in market share in that country of those exchanges, but still today, those exchanges now, the top two, Bithumb and Upbit, dominate 70-80% of retail volume, and they're incredibly profitable. Now, probably not because they don't have as much exposure to stock trading, but I mean, well, to be fair, Upbit Q4 last year announced a takeover from Naver, and so Naver, the number one discovery social app in Korea, is now, well, Naver also has equities trading as well, and so a final piece was getting a license exchange for crypto, and so you can kind of see it is, for a country like Korea, it is already being internalized as what the young people do, and so it's not as far off as, let's use somewhere like Australia. Australia here, there's people don't need to trade crypto. This is a country based on real estate and minerals, and so for them, it's like, crypto, I don't need that. Like, I have my property, it's all good. And so again, a lot of this comes down to how countries and human behavior is changing, and how the next generation plans to improve and iterate and do things for themselves. And so crypto, AI, and some of these emerging technologies, you could kind of map out how society, where each of these countries have come from historically, and how they plan to leverage this technology. And so I find that just fascinating.
What I mean, what's it like? What's it like in Oz? Like, you know, generally speaking, I mean, like I'm here in Canada, and it's kind of strange in Canada because, like, in some ways Canada is very ahead, and then in some ways we're really like reactive as a country. So where we were ahead is, like, we were like the first to approve a listed ETF vehicle for Bitcoin. Like, that was like, no one else did it, and then Canada was the first, and the early adopters and the offerers of those ETFs like made a lot of money doing that. But then there is things like, you know, I don't know, like regulatory oversight and the kind of institutional view of things like altcoins. The entire Canadian club is like, hell no. Like, we're not touching that. So much so to the point where, like, if you're a crypto related entity or a company, you are basically effectively locked out of the banking system. You know, and this is speaking from experience as a builder that's domiciled in Canada and have you know, done this. But yeah, I'm curious, what's that like in Oz? Is it similar? Is it, generally speaking, to your point, like, there is a very robust traditional financial infrastructure, therefore people don't really have to necessarily think about crypto too much. I'm just curious, like, what the flavor of, like, the culture is there.
Over the last 40, 50 years, Australia has been a great beneficiary of the mineral business, the real estate business. China in particular has been a liquidity injector historically. Probably the last 5 years, as China has had to scale back post-COVID. They've had to fight against capital flight as well. I think across the board, you could probably pin it down to just the fact that this isn't a very big country. There's only 24 million people. And for a country as wealthy as ours, which has as much GDP as ours per head, is actually quite sustainable. Healthcare is great in this country, and ultimately, there just is no need to do this. Wealth has been very well distributed across this generation. Obviously, this new generation, the ones who were here 40 years ago, have their very up-only looking graphs on their property, and so there is no social appetite. Ultimately, crypto is a bottom-up movement. The people want it. Governments don't want it. They don't need it. They tax you more than enough. They have more ways to generate GDP, and they could take taxes there. And so crypto is usually a bottom-up movement of the people want it, and they want more access to their money and more control of their money. In a country like this, where there aren't social problems like that, I think increasingly dependency on China has been confronting for this country. But ultimately, it hasn't caused social change and social movement and social uncertainty. So traction is very little. There's a listed vehicle that Animoca has backed. I think there's a few sandbox experiments for an AUD stablecoin. But again, these are kind of your fringe participants of the traditional fintech ecosystem who are looking for a way to make a name for themselves. And so across the board, Australia has historically been net buyers of software anyways. It has not been an exporter of software. Maybe some of the major Atlassian, Canvas who are now making... but again, these are true unicorns in Australia, where this country is certainly... I saw this tweet from Wei Xie talking about Singapore and how the government will be paying for free AI software usage for the country. And his point was, that's because this country has been trained to be middle managers at consulting and investment banks. There's impending due. That's the same for Singapore, Hong Kong, and certainly Australia.
All right. Yeah, well, I didn't even think about it that way. Is your entire country's population is directly in the line of sight of one Claude
to service Coca-Cola.
One Claude code update, and it's wiping out the GDP of your knowledge worker economy. Yeah. No, it's very interesting times. Very interesting times that we're in.
But again, Singapore on a 50, 60-year history as well. There was nothing here in the 50s, and so for them, any way to leapfrog and get ahead as a third world country back then, they were doing. And now they're incredibly wealthy for it. And so the next chapter then is one of, well, what do we do about the game in front of us? Ultimately, all of us are participants in a multifaceted game. And your job is you've been dealt cards. How do you play with it? Today, Singapore will be disadvantaged for the promises of Lee Kuan Yew 40, 50 years ago. Ultimately, the next leader now, Lawrence Liao, I think, now needs to figure out, well, I have a very wealthy and very skilled population base. Now, what do I do with them? Is it more entrepreneurs? Is it refactoring a lot of these workers into new skills, potentially as prompt engineers, I suppose, is what he's trying to do now. But what I find quite interesting, when you think about the microcosm of a city-state, a country, you kind of see it in a lot of these altcoins as well. You have these varied forms of this whole spectrum of fundraised different technologies that all these guys have built. On a day-by-day basis, there are new projects that are scaling down, but also many projects which are waving the flag and saying, no, we are resilient, and we're creating something valuable using crypto. One of those is Bittensor Wei, and you have been the one that has brought me into this ecosystem over the last few years, and so you're kind of the guy that I like to kind of poke and prod on, where things at. But what did you see in Bittensor back then, and when you first discovered this ecosystem? Tell us that story on what it was like and what got you interested. Because Wei, prior to all the work that you've done, you actually spent a number of years as a capital allocator in crypto before. And so you actually saw much of how capital formation and structured capital developed in the 2019, 2021 era. And so actually talk about that first before we talk about Bittensor in particular. It's certainly related.
That's an incredible vintage, right? Like 2019 was probably the starting point of, I guess you can describe it as more like institutional level funds in crypto. That was like formalizing these pools of capital to come in and invest into more esoteric technologies, right? So, you had the vanguards back then, right? The OGs, like the Polychain. Polychain was probably one of the earliest ones. Like there's ones like, I remember back in the days like Block Tower. There was like Blockchain Capital. Like those were that was like that vintage of like VCs. Shortly thereafter, it was Paradigm, which, off of the back of the success of like Uniswap, really solidified them as one of the preeminent funds in the space. And, they took a extremely kind of, I would say like decentralized technology centric view of like how we can support the ecosystem not just as capital, but as developers. And really, this was like smart contract dev, blockchain sophistication that they brought to the table. And I would put like Polychain in that camp as well, behind the leadership of Olaf, really thinking through things like mechanism design and how to create these kind of design patterns that can help to bootstrap decentralized communities, right? And decentralized groups of people that may start to converge on sharing whatever it is that they can bring to the table, whether it's resources, capital, intelligence, etc., and witnessing something where in traditional financial or economic textbooks, you would think that shouldn't happen, right? Because you generally, like, traditional economies is more like command and control resource allocation from like a centralized body, which is like board management. Here's a pool of capital, diffuse. Decentralized systems was like the counterfactual of something that should have never existed. And then you started to see examples of ecosystems that grew over time and became anti-fragile, the leaders of which were Bitcoin and ETH, right? And these were like, standout examples of things that historically we thought were impossible. So I think that was like the first intellectual point of entry into crypto where I found like this is really interesting and exciting. And then you start to learn about the ecosystem through the lens of these leading funds like Polychains and Paradigms, and later on it was like the multi-coins and the frameworks of the world. So that was a really exciting time. And they brought a lens of not just investment rigor, but also kind of this insight into decentralized systems, and was very effective at communicating that to traditional allocators, investors, capital, etc. So I think the entire ecosystem does owe a great deal to some of these leaders that were successful in being effective evangelists for decentralized technology. Because, and I think, bringing that back to an ecosystem like Tau and Bittensor, what it is today, I think Bittensor is a modern example of the success of decentralized systems and how they can coordinate what you can describe as the factors of production for intelligence and what goes into the advancement of AI. And doing that in a decentralized way is even more impressive and in some ways exciting than perhaps what the centralized frontier labs are doing and pushing the frontier in terms of performance. So I think that again was like the intellectual mapping that got me interested in Tau and Bittensor. But I think the corollary to that is Bittensor is very complex. Like, it's hard to understand as an outsider. I think even for crypto natives, it's one of those enigmatic type of ecosystems where I think you would probably make this point, Jack. Like, if you think about Solana, you immediately think about things like Jupiter, like the DeFi ecosystem of Solana, all the different types of launch pads that, kind of set off both the meme cycle as well as like internet capital markets. All of those things are things that you associate with Solana. So it's not the kind of the narrative encapsulation of Solana is more ecosystem centric. It's not necessarily Sol as this like monolithic asset in the middle that people kind of stick to. You start to branch out into all the different parts of Solana that makes that ecosystem exciting and fun to kind of be a part of. Bittensor is like, everyone discovers Bittensor, and like immediately the first point of access is to try to understand Tau, which is the underlying coordination and value accrual and emission mechanism for the network. But what's really interesting is all of the subnets and the heterogeneous type of decentralized competitions or mechanism designs and incentive models that are trying to scaffold bits and pieces of what we come to kind of conceptualize as AI. But there's a huge barrier between like first understanding what Tau is and what Bittensor is, and then also what the subnets are, right? And what they're doing and how they interrelate to each other. What is this like Tau flow emission mechanism, and it's changed 3 times already. Like, why is that happening? And what is the alpha token, and how does it, how does the price, fluctuate as a function of like inflows into the Tau AMM relative to the alpha token, relative to outflows? Like, there's massive amounts of I guess, like intellectual friction for people to adopt the ecosystem. For someone like me, I'm like, this is actually interesting. Intellectually, I just want to, I seek it. But sometimes that's at odds with bringing more and more believers into the ecosystem. And, just to bring it back full circle, I think, Tao kind of reminds me of where crypto was probably in like 2019 and 2020. There is probably room for individuals or groups of people to be really able to kind of be that translation bridge about what's going on and why it is exciting, and really convey that in a way where it's understandable and digestible by a larger cross-section of audiences, whether they're crypto native or outside of that. But the underlying thing that's really exciting about Tao is it is using a lot of the principles of decentralized systems and applying that to AI. And disparity is not the right word. The heterogeneity of the different types of experiments that are happening on Tao is what's really exciting, because you have all of these different subnets that are trying to solve different components of this broader intelligence problem. And it's something that I really want to see it bear fruit and become successful, because I do think it fulfills a role within the broader macro trend of ultimately AI is going to not consume everything, but it's going to be a pervasive technological layer that impacts every single aspect of our lives. And I think there is room in this world and an important kind of role for decentralized systems to play in that world. A lot of it has to do with, I guess, this vision of like distribution of value, control, and ultimately like safety and agency. And I care a lot about human agency in the world of AI, because this is like the biggest question mark that we stand in front of. Because you mentioned a few moments ago, it's like, is the social side of all of this is what's ultimately going to be the main problems that we confront with as a species. And I agree with that. And part of that is, where does decentralized systems play a role in that, to offer a counterpoint to what we see as a rapid percolation of power, resources, capital, influence to these centralized vectors who are becoming incredibly powerful and influential in the world as a function of the technology that they're permeating into the world. So it's not necessarily just, I'm rooting for this ecosystem and the subnets to succeed from the perspective of businesses and projects from an economic viability standpoint. I think there's a very important role as a counterweight for decentralized systems to, prove out that there's an alternative. And ultimately, I think the diversity of different concepts as we embark on this world into AI is important. If we don't have that counterbalance, I mean, you're kind of able to see it already, right? Like, we have 4 viable competitors in the frontier lab space when it comes to LLMs. There's not a high diversity industry. And even within that, I think there are a few standouts, or a couple of standouts that are really kind of head to head right now. And they're already wielding incredible amounts of power and influence. And you're starting to see the symptoms of that between governments, nation states going up against private interests, and, clashing on ideological fault lines, such as war and how we make use of this technology. And we see very prominent leaders within those organizations decide to leave because they don't believe in certain directions and or how we're treating the safety aspects of these technologies. And by extension of that is, I think the part that people just largely sweep under the rug is the distribution. Like, how are we going to manage this problem? Like, this is to me, I feel like is the biggest problem. It's, we know that this is going to be a massive capital accumulation apparatus. But once it accumulates, how are we going to redistribute that back in some type of sensible way? Because if we don't get that right, none of this really matters. Society may just collapse on it to itself. That's the level of stakes that we're playing at right now. It's just accelerating. So from that standpoint, I think decentralized systems are important. And we need to continue to, contribute to that effort. At the very least, to have some kind of counterexample that we can continue to like incubate, right? To diversify the potential outcomes that can start to like really skew to the left tail or the right tail of like probability distributions of what the world can become. So that's an extremely long-winded way of saying like Tao is intellectually extremely interesting to me. Part of it is like understanding it more, and realizing where the potential gaps are or the frictions are in terms of helping other people understand the ecosystem and continue to push that effort forward, which I think is worthwhile and very important in this kind of new world that we're about to enter.
I met this fund who was saying to me that they viewed their investment in crypto and AI almost on a barbell. They were talking about on one side they're very well positioned for the closed source world. They've made a bunch of money in Nvidia, Google, etc. And they just thought an open source alternative, even if you put 0.5, 1% of your portfolio, it was just a very simple bet for them to make. It was very obvious that having a ecosystem of tapping into global developers and intelligence, for them, it was just super obvious. We're all trying to solve the same outcomes, which is this technology is ultimately going to be massively expansive for society. And so any way to get exposure. And so it was almost on a relative performance basis of, well, big tech AI labs are running already. You can't really participate in the Anthropic private rounds, OpenAI private rounds. And so how else do I get exposure to this? You buy public equities and then you buy crypto. And so then you just go rank order. What are the major crypto ecosystems? And it's usually a decisioning between Near and Tao. I mean, Near is really fascinating as well, where they've come from. One of the OG altcoins initially was focused on, again, scalability and having its own blockchain. I think has had a bit of an existential crisis over 22, 23. They were trying to ride off much different narratives, really trying to just see what sticks in the mind of consumers, especially in 22 when the blockchain wars were very much still going on very aggressively. And having a right to survive was really important. But today, I think this AI story for them, they've recently launched Ironclaw, which is a more privacy-focused version of OpenClaw. They have some of the DeFi infrastructure has gone and done very well. I think they're generating a bunch of revenue now. That's not really on the AI side, but when people think about crypto AI, it's usually those two names that people flag as AI enough of exposure. I mean, every token is going to talk about how they have a head of AI, and my CTO used to be at this lab, but on a very distinctly AI exposure. That's quite interesting. But even talking about where you brought me, again, in this example as well, one of the most interesting subnets I've been spending a lot of time on in Bittensor has been Metanova Labs. They're focused on AI drug discovery, sitting at, I think, 10 to 15 mil market cap. This whole discussion on where the world is going, I said on the episode with Cheyenne from Multicoin, we were discussing everyone's kind of looking towards AI and robotics as this holy grail for society. And there's almost this latent opportunity on the healthcare life sciences side where, yes, it is going to be incredibly important for society to replicate manual labor, but also what are we going to do on the levels of helping humanity last longer? And so when you think about healthcare, the Web2 pharma industry is just incredible. It's incredible in its profitability, but also in how binary it can be, which is if you have a great hit, we can continue delivering hits, you're going to be very profitable, or you're just default dead. And the setup is quite simple, and love to hear how you've thought about this. But in Web2 drug discovery, we're talking about identifying the right drugs to even take through the pharma approval process from preclinical all the way to all the various phases of drug discovery can be $1 billion plus in the end-to-end process. What they do is they have to build proprietary data sets. They have to then test in wet labs, in animal trials, human trials. It's just incredibly resource intensive. And when you talk about open source versus closed source, these major pharma players like Pfizer, Novo, etc., it is very much the same battle playing out in AI, this closed source versus open source. Everyone, it's in their own interest to keep things to themselves. And they keep the research across all of these different diseases from things like cardiovascular disease to diabetes to immunology, all to themselves because they have to. It directly affects their P&L and thus their equity value. And so what you have is this new generation of new drug companies almost creating platforms where instead of spending a whole heap of money in this whole pipelining process, it is actually in the early stages where AI really sees uplift in productivity, where molecules can be more easily discovered via AI. And for it to, because there's so many multi-billion combinations of how some of these drugs could work. And let's take the example of DeepMind just spun out Isomorphic Labs, which is their healthcare, life sciences, AI vertical. I think that sat at a $4 billion valuation, raised $500 million. There's a bunch of listed companies, I think that you've mentioned to me before, Wei, that are trying to do a very similar thing. Maybe we run through some of these Web2 incumbents, and then I could actually talk about kind of how Metanova is trying to counter position as well in this whole ecosystem.
Yeah, and I think you've probably done more work now than I have in the healthcare space, because I do remember, like, probably, I don't know, start of Q4 last year, we were talking about, what's next and where is AI going to go and really start to disrupt. And yeah, and I think life sciences, healthcare is a big area. Like, to your point, I think what struck me is two things, right? Like, one is the industry is incredibly heavily regulated for good reason, right? Ultimately, whatever the research that you're doing, the drugs that you're formulating is going to impact humans, and you have to make sure that it has gone through a rigorous process. It's safe to use, because the alternative is, it could be very bad outcomes if it's pure kind of financial competition without proper guardrails. Now, the problem that it creates is these incumbents, they're incredibly capital disciplined, right? So the way that they make decisions on what types of diseases to even tackle, what problems to solve, is always through the lens of my rate of return on capital and time invested. And when you have basically a life cycle from like cradle to grave that lasts probably, I can't remember what the stat is, it's probably like 6 to 8 years at the minimum, you start to become very sensitive in terms of how you make those decisions. And what that really results in is one of the things that really struck me is, like, life sciences and health is a long tail problem. There are certain things that afflict a material portion of the population, and then there's a long tail of things that are just so fucking like esoteric and rare that almost is never addressed, because there's no economic incentive to ever tackle that. So for the people who are suffering as a function of those afflictions, it's like tough luck, right? And with AI, because AI helps to unblock some of these bottlenecks. One is, to your point, as you highlighted, it's a search problem, right? At the very early stages, it's this combinatorial explosion of different combinations of molecules that you can potentially synthesize into a drug that can treat a certain disease or illness or ailment. But using traditional means to traverse that search space would take forever. It would be economically infeasible. With AI and better models and more data, we're able to now traverse that search space in a much more efficient way. So that's a huge, unlock. And then on top of that, I think where the other dimension is just the speed at which you're able to now go through this pipeline. And the speed is important is because, like, if you ever do a DCF, right, your rate of return is very sensitive to the time dimension. To double your money in 7 years is a very different internal rate of return relative to double your money in 3 years or 2 years or 1 year. So from that standpoint, where certain endeavors did not rise to the level of like the NPV calculation or rate of return that is justifiable to commit resources, as you truncate that time, now it is viable. Therefore, institutions and groups will start to pursue those opportunities even more. So the search problem and the timeline compression are both incredible unlocks for biotech and life sciences as an industry. And those are the things that kind of stood out to me. Now, on top of that, decentralized systems can add another dimension to this. One is coordination, right? Coordination of community, the coalescence of community who have shared problems. That's very exciting. The coordination of this kind of crowd funding aspect. Like, we don't need an intermediary to green light the funding of finding a cure for XYZ disease. We can just coordinate through decentralized mechanisms and incentives around a common cause. That's a very exciting area for decentralized ecosystems and systems to play a role. And then there's obviously the capital formation side, right? And because effectively, given AI is massively deflationary, better and better capabilities are going to become cheaper and cheaper and more accessible. So what we need is just social consensus to decide to pool enough capital to tackle that problem. So all of these kind of mathematical issues that were bottlenecks that prevented us to explore solutions to problems in healthcare is now becoming less and less barriers. And then on top of that, decentralized systems gives us the opportunities to coordinate better, to find that common interest. I think the marriage of those two things is incredibly exciting. And it's probably one of the categories that I'm ultimately the most bullish on in terms of the intersection of AI and blockchain and crypto is within the life sciences space. So, and you mentioned, subnets like Metanova. I'm sure there's other examples as well. But that's kind of the condition precedent and the setup condition that led us to that initial conversation to say, hey, this stuff actually makes sense in terms of the problem statement, in terms of how AI is actually lowering the barriers, and on top of that, how decentralized systems actually play a critical role to ultimately flatten this long tail problem and actually help us create solutions to the small cohorts of people that are suffering from the long tail. I think that's super exciting.
There's a few public market leveraging AI to accelerate progress in life sciences healthcare is not new. There were people trying to position and use this type of reinforcement learning, machine learning type of format to accelerate discovery. Ultimately, their valuations have certainly been re-rated aggressively in the last few years. I think some examples we were thinking about were things like on the NASDAQ ABSI. They were listed via a reverse listing, I think 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was a SPAC actually. I think they're trading at $400 million. Recursion is also another pharma company which is trading at around $2 billion. Core to both of them, if you want to figure out legitimacy, you look at, well, what type of things are they doing with real pharma? Because ultimately, the game theory for pharma is they're always about risk protection. Yes, certainly they're trying to figure out what are the next gangbuster hits that they are going to create next. But actually, it's about preventing competition at its very core. They can't say it, but it's ultimately about how do I make sure the next drug is in my portfolio and not my counterparties. Let's look at, for example, Pfizer. They acquired Bittensor in Q4 last year. That was a GLP-1 drug. GLP, obviously, over the last 7 years has been on an aggressive up-only trend as it moved from diabetes treatment to general weight loss. And it took them almost 2-3 years since they made public announcements that GLP and weight loss was a big category that they wanted to pursue. It took them until last year, 2025, for them to give up on their own candidates and for them to spend almost $10 billion on a listed portfolio of GLP-1s under the ticker Metzera, which just goes to show you the quantum of activity, the amount of money this is worth to these big pharma. Obviously, it's because healthcare afflicts everyone. The TAM is the whole population of society, and so someone like ABSI, who has partnerships with AstraZeneca and Merck, Recursion is also doing some R&D work with Roche and Bayer. These are clear Web 2 comps that goes to show some of these frontier technologies the big pharma have to participate. I think Isomorphic Labs, again, from DeepMind, is also working with quite a few of the larger pharma companies. I don't recall exactly which ones and what they're working on, but if you are at pharma, you certainly are not going to have frontier engineering capability to the extent of these AI labs themselves. And it certainly is I need to partner with someone eventually to either buy them out or to build this capability internally. In the case of Metanova, and what you find in these Web 2 companies is that they are doing different parts of the stack in terms of drug discovery. Sometimes they specialize in particular treatments. You need to specialize because ultimately you cannot address the whole pipeline in one go. In the context of Metanova, it is very focused on molecule discovery and challenging their mining ecosystem to submit candidate molecules for potential acceleration. And so unlike traditional companies, Metanova operates actually in the earliest stages of commercialization. They are over time expanding, but what they're actually doing is leveraging chemical search algorithms. As you told me in Q4, they run 2 programs, a compound challenge, which miners with more of a bio background can actually submit molecules in protein targets that they're looking for. That's one stream. The other stream is called the Blueprint Challenge that they recently launched, which is actually submitting search algorithm code itself that actually helps them explore chemical. Again, I'm not a life science guy, and so I'm trying to understand all of this. It's about exploring this chemical space more efficiently as well. And so across the board, the whole idea is on a pipeline basis, if you could really go top of funnel and expand the mapped universe of chemical compounds, that then allows you to figure out, okay, what do we not know? And then figure out, hey, of these, now that we do know, how much of this is valuable for potential new drugs that we create? That seems like incredibly uplifting for us as humanity as a whole. I think also Metanova are now expanding beyond. I think they're also in the process of finalizing deals with wet labs such that they can actually start conducting some of this testing themselves, which we find incredibly compelling. So if you can take it back to the thesis of Tau, the only reason Metanova was able to come into existence relative to a Recursion and Avsci on the NASDAQ is instead of a closed source, I hire AI engineers or engineers with this type of capability internally. They leverage a wider community of global miners who you can imagine someone, and this is a South American team, you can imagine someone in Australia, someone in New York, someone in India who can then participate if they have any sort of background and be able to contribute. Ultimately, when we talk about democratization of intelligence, this is what we talk about. It's about there's latent intelligence and money that would like to support some of these causes. It doesn't matter. They don't care where the causes are geographically. They care about participating in the mission and pushing forward whatever objective that they have. And Metanova in particular is one of the first healthcare life science initiatives on Bittensor where it's just incredibly exciting. Now they're incredibly early stage. There's no revenue. There obviously has been nothing that has gone into wet lab testing just yet. But on paper, it is ultimately a David versus Goliath type of situation, which is we need as many alternatives as possible. You certainly do not want DeepMind to be the whole arbiter of what drugs your parents take. And so a vibrant competitive dynamic eventually will lead to consolidation, but what you want to see is as much competition such that even when consolidation occurs, that there's a lot of alternatives. There's a lot of people taking on different. It's a good thing that Pfizer was unsuccessful in going after the weight loss category. That's a good thing. It means that there's a lot of it's not easy, and it affects a lot of people, and so it shouldn't be easy.
Yeah, I agree, and I think this kind of circles back to why the broader Tau concept and ecosystem is so interesting. The underlying kind of incentive structure of Tau is pretty agnostic into the type of use case that people want to leverage the ecosystem to help build in a decentralized kind of AI context.
I think what people fail to understand in the construction of this open ecosystem of Bittensor is what you find is every subnet entrepreneur is trying to take on a Web 2 market with already entrenched incumbents, often listed companies. These are real use cases that people are trying to go after. Instead of taking multi-years to R&D, you get to accelerate that via leveraging a global marketplace of intelligence, capital. That's the miners, those are the investors. The whole idea is that you can actually accelerate progress via a global community. That makes a whole bunch of sense. Let's use a few examples. I was introduced to the team from Babelbit. They're creating a real-time translation service. And for them, the founder was one of the co-founders for BBC News Online, ITV Player. He spent 25 years before his time at BBC working on speech tech. And so in this case, what they're trying to do is create this for predictive utterance completion. I think that's what they're calling it. It's using LLMs to predict the speaker's next words and helping to accelerate the translation before the sentence is complete. And so it's about lower latency than waiting in Google Translate. What they're trying to go after is using Google Translate, which you finish writing or you finish speaking and then it translates, that sounds like a very hard market to crack, but it's so interesting. You then look at something like Yanez. Yanez is a synthetic KYC ML testing platform. They have signed deals with listed NASDAQ companies focused on pen testing some of their KYC AML defense mechanisms. The Web 2 competition using something like Verif or Jumio, these are all listed. They're trading at $1 to $5 billion. With these Web 2 vendors, they essentially sell static tests. They sell static test data sets and say, hey, here are a whole list of, it's binary. It's either these are real IDs or fake IDs. They just run these sandbox simulations for the customer, which does not seem very dynamic. And so what Yanez is trying to do is they're creating this adversarial loop. Miners generate these identities. So they're trying to deepfake, for example, biometrics. They're trying to forge documents, potentially different sanction evasion type of strategies. And then on the other side, validators try to catch them. So miners generate these things. Validators try to catch all of these different attack vectors, which means that they're actually the engine that they're building is learning. And what Yanez is trying to do is they're trying to create targets such that it, over time, increasingly fills out this type of pen testing. It's really important, as you said, on this mapping of the discoverable drug universe, molecule universe. You need to figure out the long tail. You need to go find those long tails, because that, for someone like in the KYC AML for TradFi, that can be worth millions of dollars in fines. And so what happens is then banks and these financial institutions get an actual living stress test. Yanez in particular, these guys have been former tech founders. They have raised almost $1 million. Yuma has accelerated them. What's really interesting is that it's a rare subnet going after these, like an obvious whale customer. And if you have a very competitive solution, it could be multi-year lock-in periods. But again, there's this R&D period now. The incumbents are here. These new subnets are trying to come and compete. And the whole idea is you can accelerate that and leapfrog them, ideally, via leveraging these type of incentive, red team, blue team type of mechanisms, which we find so fascinating. Yuma actually also announced a new subnet yesterday called Beam, which is essentially trying to tokenize idle bandwidth globally. And so instead of this is such a topical point, data centers and hardware like this it's just been up only over the last few years. Bitcoin miners are now transitioning to AI data centers, apparently. In this case, for Beam, miners are contributing unused capacity and they're earning the actual underlying subnet. For Beam itself, who's actually this marketplace that they're creating, there is no CapEx. There is no vendor lock-in. Think about it as almost an Airbnb. Airbnb does not actually hold the underlying assets. They are a marketplace for idle bandwidth around the world to be able to monetize. And so you kind of see a view of the world that makes sense. It's going to take time. There's a certain developer that's attracted to Bittensor, which actually I think is very positive for venture capital in particular, is the argument that I hear most often is, why does this not exist already as a venture capital backed company? If this business case is so compelling, why do they not raise independent financing and launch a new token? Which I think actually is a very smart thing to say. And from my opinion, what is very obvious that comes across our desk when we evaluate these deals is that there's a certain entrepreneur who values go to market more than they do this venture capital, which is they think that coming to market as quickly as possible. Because think about the delta, spending multi-months, putting a fundraising round together, hiring a team, etc., versus launch a subnet, launch a token, actually in case one, raise money, get a product to a certain level where they can actually launch a coin. That probably takes a year or so. at its very optimistic case, versus a subnet, which is actually in a month or so, we actually can launch a subnet and actually start giving out currency and actually attracting people to progress this marketplace that we're building. And so actually what you find is the entrepreneurs on Bittensor are actually more of I don't want to either, I think I need to get this product out to market now, and I need any type of acceleration, or it is the one who, for example, Matt from the founder of Babelbit, his point to me is, I don't want to be a servant to venture capital. If I could do this myself, I'll do it myself, which is very interesting. And it's taken me a few months to actually understand that, but that's just an interesting reflection on some of the entrepreneurs there.
It's certainly by no means any easier to survive in kind of this Darwinian competition, as you framed it, that is Bittensor. But I think there is some elegance in the perspective that, ultimately you kind of control your own destiny, in the sense that if you do well, there are vectors of control that you would have, that are different relative to a kind of adventure-backed type project or a company or a construct. But it does take a very different type of builder to want to seek out this challenge that is Bittensor. And you innately you root for those people, especially if they're well-intentioned in trying to solve a hard problem that hasn't necessarily been tackled in the way that they're approaching it currently. And I think from that standpoint also, like, people need to be very aware that most, and by most I mean almost 100% of all projects on Bittensor, like these subnets, are incredibly early experimental conceptual projects, right? They're not mature cash flow generative. I'd say maybe less than a handful are, like, you can say, are on that initial curve of finding product market fit and demonstrating scalable revenue generation. But beyond that, it's like most of the time you're taking large amounts of conceptual risk. So this is not for the faint of heart, so to speak, when it comes to like investors, but it's also why it's so exciting. And the degrees of freedom in which the builders have in expressing their creativity and problem solving is also incredibly fun and exciting, to just be an observer, and having, to your point, Jack, like having that access and meeting all these teams and speaking to them. Very few places or ecosystems or domains are you able to find such intellectually stimulating and interesting things to kind of dig into. So I think from that standpoint, a lot of respect for a lot of these builders, many of these builders that are building in the Bittensor ecosystem. And I think it's still one of the most intellectually satisfying places to be, in crypto or elsewhere. So from that standpoint alone, if you are that type of person, there's no better ecosystem, in my opinion, to like spend time. And the sum total of all the intellectual capacity that kind of continues to aggregate around this ecosystem will only make it better.
We went from broad macro bearishness to talk about society to how we need AI in life sciences. I think there's been a lot of content. Wei, I want to thank you for being generous with your time, man. One of the smartest guys that I know. It's always good to have you on, bro. Thanks.
Of course, anytime. Hope you have me back, man, for round 3.
Let's go, baby.
That is.
I think
hopefully
so.
At that point, Bitcoin's at 150K, and we're just weighing our bags instead of it'll be a whole different conversation at that.
We'll look
point.
at green dildos instead of choppy trading. Yeah, I agree.
Exactly.
Don't worry. It's good. It's going to be a promise to our audience. Weighs back at 150K. Okay, so get to buy.
Yeah, I won't get to come back until
yeah. If you want this guy back, that's actually a proxy for your reputation. If it's not a 150K, you're not valuable, man.
There we go. Here, let's start a poly market. Let's start a part of the poly market.
What will happen first?
Weighs back on Supercycle by X date.
So some like derivative way to fucking bid on Bitcoin. So basically, you're saying
Yeah, exactly.
never.
Exactly.
Yeah, shit.
Awesome.
All right.
All right,
Thanks.
bro.
But